Federal agents storm the mansion at dawn. Isabel stands frozen as they drag boxes of evidence past her bodyguard lover. Her billionaire husband faces prison. His empire crumbles. And the affair she thought was secret, everyone's about to know. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. A lonely trophy wife walked in on her black bodyguard in a moment of private release. "Let me finish," she begged, her voice trembling with desire she'd buried for years. What begins as forbidden attraction in a marble palace of isolation becomes something neither can deny. She's trapped in a loveless marriage to a billionaire who treats her like another possession. He's sworn to protect her body, but never expected she'd awaken his heart. As stolen glances turn to secret touches and boundaries blur in the dead of night, they're playing with fire that could destroy everything. But when you've been starving for real connection, sometimes you're willing to burn. The afternoon sun filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric shadows across the pristine white marble of the Ashford estate. Isabel Monroe stood motionless in her walk-in closet, studying her reflection in the gilt-edged mirror. At 32, she possessed the kind of beauty that graced magazine covers. Blonde hair that fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, porcelain skin that required an army of estheticians to maintain, and a figure sculpted by personal trainers and carefully monitored diets. She wore a cream silk blouse and tailored slacks that cost more than most people's monthly rent, yet the woman staring back at her looked utterly hollow. She adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet, the stones catching the light with cold brilliance. It was one of many gifts from her husband, Richard Ashford, each piece of jewelry a beautiful cage. A reminder of the bargain she'd made 5 years ago when she'd been a struggling art student, and he'd been a recently divorced tech billionaire looking for a beautiful young wife to complete his perfect life. Isabel walked through the sprawling master suite, her heels clicking against marble floors that echoed with emptiness. The room could have housed 3 families comfortably, decorated in shades of white and cream that Richard's interior designer had assured them projected elegance and sophistication. To Isabel, it felt like living inside a museum, beautiful but lifeless, a place where you looked but never touched. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard's assistant. "Mr. Ashford will be staying in the city tonight. Business dinner running late." The words didn't even pretend anymore. Isabel knew business dinner was code for his mistress, a 24-year-old PR executive who worked for his company. She'd known about the affairs for 2 years now, ever since she'd accidentally seen messages on his iPad. There had been 3 different women since then, each younger and more ambitious than the last. The funny thing was, Isabel didn't even feel jealous anymore. That emotion required caring, and she'd stopped caring about Richard's attention months ago. What she felt instead was a crushing loneliness, a hollowness that expanded with each passing day in this beautiful prison. She descended the curved marble staircase, her hand gliding along the wrought iron railing. The house was quiet except for the distant sounds of the household staff going about their duties. Maria in the kitchen preparing dinner Isabel wouldn't eat. James tending the gardens Isabel rarely walked through. And somewhere in the house, doing his rounds, was Darius. Darius Cole had been her bodyguard for 3 months now, assigned after a disturbing incident where an obsessed fan of Richard's had shown up at one of Isabel's charity events with unsettling intentions. At first, she'd resented the intrusion into her already restricted life. The idea of having someone follow her everywhere, watching her every move, had felt suffocating. But Darius wasn't what she'd expected. While most of Richard's employees treated her with the distant politeness reserved for expensive property, Darius had looked at her and actually seen a person. He was a former Marine, 35 years old, with deep brown skin, intelligent dark eyes, and a quiet strength that filled whatever room he entered. He stood 6'4" with broad shoulders and a powerful build that spoke of discipline and dedication. What struck Isabel most wasn't his imposing physical presence. It was the way he listened when she spoke, really listened, as if her words mattered. In their 3 months together, they'd shared more genuine conversations than she'd had with Richard in 5 years of marriage. Isabel found herself in the library, a room Richard had designed to impress business associates, but never actually used. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held first editions he'd never read, arranged by color rather than content. She ran her fingers along the spines, pulling out a volume of poetry she'd been reading in secret. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Darius appeared in the doorway, filling it with his presence. He wore his usual attire, black tactical pants and a fitted black shirt that couldn't hide his muscular frame. His expression was professional, but Isabel had learned to read the subtle shifts in his features. Right now, concern flickered in his dark eyes. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his deep voice carrying that slight southern accent she'd come to find comforting. "Just checking the perimeter. Everything all right?" Isabel held up the book with a hollow smile. "Just looking for company. Apparently dead poets are my best option these days." Something changed in Darius's expression, a softening around his eyes. He stepped into the room, maintaining a respectful distance. Those same poets who understood loneliness pretty well, I'd imagine. The comment was casual, but Isabel felt her chest tighten. It was the kind of thing someone said when they saw you, truly saw you, not the perfect trophy wife facade she maintained for the rest of the world. She set the book down, suddenly unable to meet his eyes. "Your husband working late again?" There was no judgment in Darius's tone, but Isabel felt heat rise to her cheeks anyway. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. The library suddenly felt too intimate, too small despite its grand proportions. She was acutely aware of how close Darius stood, the warmth that seemed to radiate from his presence. "I should let you get back to work," she said quietly, moving toward the door. As she passed him, their eyes met for a moment too long. Isabel felt something electric pass between them, something dangerous and thrilling that made her heart race. She hurried from the room, her breath coming faster than it should from such a simple interaction. That night, Isabel lay alone in her massive bed, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. The house settled around her with creaks and whispers, and she found herself thinking about Darius, about the way he looked at her, about how his presence made her feel seen for the first time in years. She closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but they persisted. Somewhere in the house, Darius was doing his nightly rounds, protecting her from external threats while she struggled with the danger growing inside her own heart. The late afternoon heat hung heavy over the estate, driving everyone indoors except Isabel, who wandered the grounds aimlessly. Richard had texted that he was staying in the city again, the third night this week. She told herself she didn't care, but the loneliness pressed in regardless. She found herself walking toward the pool house, thinking she might swim to clear her head. As she approached, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, and heard water running from inside. She pushed the door open quietly, assuming Maria had left a tap running. But it wasn't Maria. Through the open bathroom door at the far end of the pool house, Isabel could see Darius in the shower. The glass enclosure was clear, and he stood under the spray with his back to her, completely unaware of her presence. Water cascaded over his dark skin, over the powerful muscles of his shoulders and back. Isabel should have left immediately, should have backed out quietly and pretended she'd never seen anything. But she stood frozen, her eyes traveling down his body, taking in every detail of him. He was magnificent. Tall and powerfully built, his body was sculpted perfection. And when he turned slightly to reach for the soap, Isabel's breath caught in her throat. Even from this distance, even through the steam, she could see he was impressively endowed, his manhood hanging heavy and substantial between his muscular thighs. Heat flooded through Isabel's body, pooling low in her belly. She'd never seen a man built like this, never felt such immediate, overwhelming desire. Her hand flew to her mouth as she watched him soap his chest, his movements efficient and unself-conscious. Then his hand traveled lower, wrapping around himself, and Isabel realized what she was witnessing. Darius began stroking slowly, his head falling back under the spray, his other hand bracing against the tile wall. His breathing grew heavier, visible in the rise and fall of his chest. Isabel knew she should leave. This was private, intimate, wrong to witness. But her feet wouldn't move. She watched, transfixed, as his hand moved with increasing urgency, as his powerful body tensed with building pleasure. A small sound escaped her throat, barely audible over the running water, but Darius heard it. His head snapped toward the door, his dark eyes locking onto hers through the steam. Isabel expected him to stop, to cover himself, to be angry or embarrassed. Instead, something shifted in his expression. His hand stilled but didn't pull away. For a long, charged moment, they simply stared at each other. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice rough and deeper than she'd ever heard it. "You should go." But Isabel couldn't move. Her heart pounded as she watched water stream over his incredible body, as she saw him still achingly aroused, his hand wrapped around his considerable length. "I should," she heard herself whisper. "But I can't." Darius's jaw clenched, muscles flexing in his arm as he fought for control. "This isn't appropriate," he said. But he didn't move to cover himself, didn't turn away from her gaze. "I know," Isabel breathed, taking a step closer instead of backing away. "Nothing about this is appropriate." "If you don't leave right now," Darius said, his voice strained, "something's going to happen that we can't take back." Isabel's hands trembled as she reached for the tie of her sundress. "Maybe I don't want to take it back." She watched his eyes darken, watched his hand unconsciously tighten around himself. The air between them felt electric, charged with months of unspoken tension finally reaching its breaking point. "Let me finish," she said softly, the words barely audible. "Please, let me watch you finish." The request was brazen, shocking even to her own ears. But Isabel was past caring about propriety. She was drowning in years of loneliness and neglect, and this man, this beautiful, powerful man, made her feel alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Darius's breathing grew heavier. His eyes never left hers as his hand began to move again, slow strokes that made his muscles ripple. "Jesus, Isabel," he groaned. "Do you know what you're doing to me?" "Show me," she whispered, her own hands sliding down her body, pressing against herself through the thin fabric of her dress. "Show me what I do to you." What followed was the most erotic experience of Isabel's life. They touched themselves while watching each other, separated by distance, but connected by the intensity of their shared desire. Darius's movements grew more urgent, his powerful body tensing as he approached his peak. "Say my name," he commanded, his voice rough. "Not Mrs. Ashford. Say my name." "Darius," Isabel breathed, her own pleasure building. "Oh God, Darius." The sound of his name on her lips pushed him over the edge. He groaned deep in his chest, his body shuddering as he found his release, the evidence of his pleasure washing away under the spray. Isabel watched every second, memorizing the way he looked lost in ecstasy, the way his face transformed with pleasure. Afterwards, as Darius stood breathing hard under the water, reality began to creep back in. He shut off the shower and grabbed a towel, wrapping it around his waist before stepping out. Isabel still stood rooted to the spot, her body humming with unfulfilled desire. "We crossed a line," Darius said quietly, water still dripping from his skin. "Yes," Isabel agreed, her voice shaky. "We did." He moved toward her slowly, stopping just inches away. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell clean soap and pure masculine musk. "This can't happen again," he said, but his eyes told a different story. "You're married. I work for your husband. This is wrong on every level." "I know," Isabel whispered, "but I can't stop thinking about you. Can't stop wanting you." Darius's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "You're lonely and neglected, and I'm convenient. That's all this is it?" Isabel challenged, covering his hand with hers. "Because it feels like more than that." The tension between them was unbearable. Darius's eyes dropped to her lips, and Isabel knew he was going to kiss her. Knew that once he did, there would be no going back. He closed the distance between them, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both tender and hungry. Isabel melted into him, her hands sliding up his damp chest to wrap around his neck. The towel around his waist was the only barrier between them. and she could feel the evidence of his continued arousal pressing against her. "We shouldn't," Darius breathed against her mouth, even as his hands slid down to grip her hips, pulling her closer. "I know," Isabel agreed, but she was already untying her dress, letting it slip to the floor. What followed was inevitable, explosive, everything that had been building between them since the day they met. Darius lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around his waist as he pressed her against the tiled wall. When he entered her, Isabel cried out, overwhelmed by the fullness of him, by the way he seemed to touch places inside her she didn't know existed. They moved together with desperate urgency, months of denial finally breaking free. Darius was powerful but careful, his large hands gentle even in passion, always making sure she was with him, always checking her face for any sign of discomfort. But there was no discomfort, only pleasure building and building, until Isabel shattered in his arms, crying his name as waves of ecstasy washed over her. Darius followed moments later, his face buried in her neck, his powerful body shuddering with release. Afterwards, they stood there breathing hard, reality crashing down around them. Isabel's feet found the floor, her legs unsteady. Darius stepped back, running his hand over his face. "God," he said quietly, "what did we just do?" Isabel pulled her dress back on with shaking hands, the magnitude of what they'd done settling over her. "I should go," she whispered. "Isabel, wait." Darius caught her wrist gently. "We need to talk about this." But she was already backing toward the door, overwhelmed and scared and exhilarated all at once. "I can't. Not right now. I just need to think." She fled the pool house, leaving Darius standing there, and didn't stop until she was back in her bedroom, door locked, heart racing. She sank onto her bed, pressing her hands to her flushed cheeks. What had she done? She'd crossed every line, violated her marriage vows, taken advantage of an employee. But even as guilt tried to surface, she couldn't regret it. For the first time in 5 years, she'd felt truly alive. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. Isabel went through the motions of her carefully orchestrated life, breakfast with green juice she forced down, checking emails, pretending everything was normal. But she could still feel Darius inside her, could still hear the sounds he'd made, could still taste him on her lips. Around noon, Maria brought lunch to the sunroom. "Mister," "Darius asked me to tell you he'll be doing a security check of the grounds this afternoon," she said, her face neutral. "He wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable in the house alone." The message was clear. He was giving her space, staying away so she could process what had happened. Isabel felt a rush of gratitude mixed with disappointment. That afternoon, she found herself in Richard's study, staring at her phone. A text from her husband sat unanswered. "Staying in the city again tonight. Early meeting tomorrow." Isabel looked at the message, at the casual dismissal of her, the complete lack of intimacy or warmth. She thought about Darius, about the way he'd looked at her with such hunger and tenderness, about the way he'd made her feel precious and desired. Her phone buzzed with a new message, this one from Darius. "We should talk. When you're ready. No pressure." Isabel stared at the words, her heart pounding. This was the moment of choice. She could pretend it never happened, go back to her empty marriage and lonely existence. Or she could acknowledge what was growing between them, even knowing it would complicate everything. Her fingers moved across the screen before she could second-guess herself. "Tonight. After the staff leaves. Meet me in the library." His response came quickly. "I'll be there." As evening approached and the household staff departed one by one, Isabel changed into a simple dress and waited in the library. Her heart raced with anticipation and nerves. When Darius appeared in the doorway, dressed in dark jeans and a fitted shirt, the air between them immediately crackled with tension. They stood on opposite sides of the room for a long moment, just looking at each other. Finally, Darius spoke. "I need you to know something," he said, his deep voice quiet but intense. "What happened this afternoon, it wasn't just physical for me. I've been fighting my feelings for you since the day we met." Isabel's breath caught. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "But I don't know what to do about it. I'm married. You work for my husband." This is impossible. Is it? Darius moved closer. Because from where I'm standing, you're trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who neglects you. And I'm falling for a woman I can't have. The honesty in his words made tears spring to Isabel's eyes. What are we supposed to do? Tell me what you want, Darius said, now standing close enough that she could feel his warmth. Not what you think you should want. What do you actually want? Isabel looked up at him, this man who'd awakened something inside her she thought was dead. I want to feel alive again, she whispered. I want to be seen and desired and valued. I want you. Then have me, Darius said simply. We'll figure out the rest as we go. He kissed her then, tender and deep, and Isabel knew she was choosing a path that would change everything. But as his arms wrapped around her and she felt that connection again, that spark of real intimacy and desire, she couldn't bring herself to care about the consequences. They would face them together. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. Isabel went through the motions of her carefully orchestrated life. Breakfast with green juice she forced down. A session with her personal trainer, who pushed her through exercises she performed mechanically. A video call with the event planner for Richard's upcoming charity gala. She smiled and nodded and played her part, all while her mind kept drifting back to those few charged moments in the pool house. Around noon, Maria brought lunch to the sunroom where Isabel sat pretending to read a design magazine. A beautifully arranged salad that looked like art and tasted like nothing, paired with sparkling water and crystal stemware. Mister, Darius asked me to tell you he'll be doing a security check of the grounds this afternoon, Maria said, her kind face neutral, but her eyes knowing. He wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable in the house alone. Isabel's pulse quickened despite herself. I'm fine, Maria. Thank you. After the housekeeper left, Isabel pushed the salad around her plate, unable to eat. She felt restless, trapped, like her skin was too tight for her body. The enormous house felt suffocating, despite its soaring ceilings and open floor plan. She wandered into Richard's study, a room she rarely entered. It smelled of expensive leather and his cologne, a scent that used to make her feel safe, and now just reminded her of how little she knew the man she'd married. His desk was massive and imposing, covered with papers and contracts she didn't understand. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Staying in the city again tonight. Early meeting tomorrow. The message was perfunctory. No endearments, no apologies, just information delivered like a weather report. Isabel set the phone down and noticed movement outside the window. Darius was walking the perimeter of the property, his movements efficient and purposeful. She watched him disappear around the corner of the house and felt that pull again, that dangerous curiosity that was becoming harder to ignore. The afternoon stretched on, endlessly. Isabel tried to distract herself with the tasks that usually filled her days. She approved seating charts for the gala, responded to emails from various charity boards, reviewed fabric swatches for a room renovation she didn't care about. But underneath it all was a thrumming awareness, a current of electricity that made her skin feel too sensitive. As evening approached, she found herself in her bathroom, studying her reflection with unusual intensity. She applied fresh makeup, changed from her casual clothes into a fitted dress that hugged her curves, told herself she was just maintaining standards, just being the perfect Mrs. Ashford. But when she descended the stairs and found Darius in the foyer, reviewing something on his tablet, she knew she was lying to herself. He looked up as she approached, and she saw his eyes widen slightly before his expression became carefully neutral. Mrs. Ashford, he said. Everything okay? Fine, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. I thought I'd have dinner on the terrace tonight. The weather's nice. Would you like me to inform Maria? Actually, Isabel heard herself say, surprised by her own boldness, I was wondering if you'd join me. That is, if you haven't eaten yet. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Darius's dark eyes searched her face, and Isabel saw the war playing out behind them, duty versus desire, professionalism versus the undeniable pull between them. Mrs. Ashford, he began, his voice carefully measured. Please, she interrupted, something raw in her voice. Just Isabella. And I'd like the company, if that's appropriate. The word appropriate hung in the air between them, a fragile lie they both knew they were telling themselves. Darius was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'd be honored, he said, and Isabel felt her heart skip. They sat across from each other on the terrace as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Maria had outdone herself, preparing a meal that looked like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant. But Isabel barely tasted the food, too focused on the man sitting across from her. Tell me about yourself, she said, realizing how little she actually knew about him beyond the professional. The real you, not the bodyguard. Darius smiled, a slow curve of his lips that transformed his usually serious face. There's not much to tell. Grew up in Georgia, small town outside Atlanta. Joined the Marines right after high school. Served 2 tours overseas. Got out and did private security work, which eventually led me here. That's the resume version. Isabel pressed gently. What about the person underneath? What do you dream about? What makes you laugh? He studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. I dream about having a place of my own someday, he said finally. Nothing fancy. Just some land, maybe near the mountains. Peace and quiet. As for laughing, he paused, his eyes warming. I've got a nephew, 7 years old, convinced he's going to be a superhero. The stories he tells are pretty entertaining. Isabel found herself smiling, genuinely smiling, for the first time in weeks. Tell me more. So, Darius did. He talked about his sister and her family, about the books he read late at night, about his love for old jazz music and morning runs, when the world was still quiet. His voice was deep and soothing, and Isabel let herself get lost in it, in the simple pleasure of real conversation with someone who treated her like a person, rather than an ornament. What about you? Darius asked as their plates were cleared away. Who were you before all this? Isabel felt a lump form in her throat. I was an artist, she said quietly. Or trying to be. I painted. Nothing good enough to make a living from, but it made me happy. I had this tiny studio apartment with terrible light, and I'd paint for hours, losing track of time completely. What happened to that? I met Richard, she said simply. He was so charming, so sure of himself. He made me feel like I could have a different life, security, stability. I thought I was being practical. I didn't realize I was trading one kind of poverty for another. The words hung in the air, more honest than Isabel had intended to be. She looked down at her hands, twisted with her napkin. You could start painting again, Darius said gently. Isabel laughed, but there was no humor in it. Richard's interior designer has very specific visions for the house. My input isn't required. I wasn't talking about painting the house, Darius said, his eyes intense on hers. I was talking about painting for yourself. The idea felt revolutionary and terrifying all at once. Before Isabel could respond, her phone buzzed with another text from Richard. Don't wait up. Very busy week ahead. Darius must have seen something shift in her expression because he stood. I should let you get some rest, he said, but his eyes were gentle. Thank you for dinner, Isabel. The use of her first name sent a shiver through her. Thank you for the company, she replied softly. She watched him walk away, his tall frame disappearing into the house, and felt the loneliness settle back over her like a familiar cloak. But underneath it now was something else, a small flame of possibility that both thrilled and terrified her. That night, Isabel lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind replaying every moment of their dinner, every smile, every word. She knew she was playing with fire. She knew this growing connection with Darius was dangerous, inappropriate, potentially devastating. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, she found herself dreaming not of the consequences, but of dark eyes that saw her, truly saw her, and a deep voice that made her feel alive for the first time in years. The next morning brought rain, a steady downpour that drummed against the windows and turned the manicured grounds into impressionist paintings of green and gray. Isabel stood in the conservatory, watching water stream down the glass walls while her untouched coffee grew cold beside her. She'd spent the early morning hours texting with Richard, a stilted conversation about his schedule and the upcoming gala. He was staying in the city for the rest of the week, a pattern that had become their new normal. The house was hers, beautiful and empty, a gilded cage where even the rain couldn't reach her. "Mrs. Ashfald." She turned to find Darius in the doorway, water droplets clinging to his close-cropped hair and dampening his black shirt. He'd clearly just come in from outside. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he continued, his expression professionally neutral, "but I wanted to inform you that the security cameras on the east side are being serviced today. The team should be here within the hour." "Thank you for letting me know," Isabel replied, hating how formal they sounded after last night's dinner. She wanted to ask him if he'd thought about their conversation, if he'd felt the same electricity she had, but the words stuck in her throat. Darius nodded and turned to leave, but Isabel found herself speaking. "The rain," she said quickly. "It's beautiful, isn't it? The way it transforms everything." He paused, looking back at her. Then, instead of giving a polite response and leaving, he walked further into the conservatory, coming to stand near the windows. His presence filled the space, and Isabel was acutely aware of every breath, every small movement. "I've always liked the rain," Darius said quietly, his eyes on the storm outside, especially the sound of it. "There's something honest about it." "Honest?" He turned to face her, and Isabel felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze. "It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. No performance, no facade. Just raw and real." The words felt loaded with meaning, and Isabel's pulse quickened. "Are we still talking about the rain?" Darius's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We should be," he said, his voice low. The tension between them was thick enough to taste. Isabel took a step closer, drawn by a force she couldn't name and didn't want to resist. Darius didn't move, but she could see the war playing out in his eyes, duty battling against something deeper and more primal. "Isabel," he said, her name a warning and a plea all at once. "We can't." "Can't what?" She was close enough now to feel the heat radiating from his body, to see the rapid pulse at his throat. "Can't do what we both know we want to do," he said, his voice rough. "You're married. You're my employer. I'm here to protect you, not to what?" "Not to what?" Isabel pressed, emboldened by something reckless inside her. "Not to see me as a woman instead of just another asset to guard?" "I've always seen you as a woman," Darius said, his control clearly slipping. "That's the problem. From the first day I met you, I've seen you. All of you. The loneliness you hide behind that perfect smile. The sadness in your eyes when you think no one's looking. The way you fade a little more each day in this beautiful prison." His words struck her like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. No one had ever seen her so clearly, not even herself. "Then why?" she whispered, tears threatening to fall. "Why do we have to pretend there's nothing here?" "Because," Darius said, reaching up to cup her face with one large hand, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "Because you deserve more than stolen moments and secret shame. You deserve someone who can claim you in the daylight, who can give you the life you should have had." "And what if I don't want that?" Isabel leaned into his touch, her eyes closing at the warmth of his palm against her cheek. "What if I just want this? Right now. Whatever this is." She felt Darius's other hand come to rest on her waist, his fingers spreading across her hip. The touch sent electricity through her entire body. When she opened her eyes, his face was closer than before, his lips just inches from hers. "Isabel," he breathed, and she could feel the word as much as hear it. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, followed by voices. The security team had arrived early. Darius stepped back so quickly Isabel almost stumbled. His hands fell away from her body, leaving cold spaces where warmth had been. "I need to go supervise the installation," he said, his voice professionally controlled once more, though his eyes still blazed with everything they'd just shared. Isabel could only nod, her heart pounding, her skin still tingling from his touch. She watched him walk away, his back rigid with tension, and wrapped her arms around herself. The rain continued to fall, honest and unrelenting, while inside Isabel felt something breaking open inside her chest, something that had been locked away for far too long. The week crawled by with agonizing slowness. Richard remained in the city, sending occasional texts about business matters and gala preparations. Isabel threw herself into the event planning with unusual intensity, needing something to distract herself from the memory of Darius's hands on her face, his breath against her lips, the way he'd looked at her like she was both precious and dangerous. They were careful around each other now, maintaining professional distance that felt like play acting. But Isabel caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, and she knew he felt the same magnetic pull she did, growing stronger each day despite their best efforts to resist it. The night before the gala, Isabel stood in her dressing room surrounded by the chaos of preparation. Her stylist had just left after a final fitting of her gown, a stunning creation of midnight blue silk that hugged every curve before flowing into a dramatic train. Tomorrow night, she would stand beside Richard, playing the perfect wife while he smiled for cameras and networked with other billionaires. The thought made her feel ill. She was removing the last of the pins from her hair when she heard raised voices from somewhere in the house. Concerned, she wrapped a silk robe over her slip and hurried toward the sound. The argument was coming from Richard's study. Isabel paused in the hallway, recognizing Darius's deep voice, tense with barely controlled anger. "With all due respect, sir, that's not my responsibility," Darius was saying. "I'm here to provide security, not to cover for your personal activities." Richard's voice was cold and cutting. "You're here because I pay you to be here. And right now, I'm telling you that if anyone asks where I am tonight, you tell them I'm in a business meeting." There was a pause, then Darius spoke again, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is that what you'd like me to tell your wife as well?" Isabel's hand flew to her mouth. She shouldn't be listening to this, but she couldn't seem to make herself move. "My wife," Richard said with cruel emphasis, "knows her place. She understands the arrangement. She lives in luxury, and in exchange, she doesn't ask questions she doesn't want answered." Shame and anger weared in Isabel's chest. Was that truly how Richard saw their marriage? As a business arrangement, where her comfort could be bought with expensive clothes and empty rooms? "Mr. Ashford," Darius said, and Isabel could hear the steel beneath his professional tone. "I took this position to protect Mrs. Ashford from external threats. I won't be part of whatever's happening that might harm her in other ways." The study door flew open, and Richard emerged, his face flushed with anger. He stopped short when he saw Isabel standing in the hallway, her face pale. "How long have you been standing there?" Richard demanded. "Long enough," Isabel replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Richard's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on irritation. "This is a private business discussion. Isabel, it doesn't concern you." Darius appeared in the doorway behind Richard, his face carefully blank, but his eyes found Isabel's with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I think it concerns me very much," Isabel said quietly, "when my husband is asking my bodyguard to lie about where he spends his nights." Richard's jaw tightened. "Don't be dramatic. You've known the nature of our marriage for years." "Known it, yes," Isabel replied, feeling something crack inside her. "Accepted it? Maybe. But that doesn't make it right. This is ridiculous," Richard snapped. "I don't have time for this melodrama. I have a dinner to get to." He brushed past Isabel without another word, already pulling out his phone to make a call. She listened to his footsteps receding, heard the front door slam, then stood in the hallway feeling like she'd been hollowed out. "Mrs. Ashford," Darius said softly, stepping closer. "Are you all right?" Isabel looked up at him. This man who'd just risked his job to defend her honor to a husband who'd stopped caring years ago. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know what I am anymore." Darius reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand. His palm was warm and solid against hers, an anchor in the storm of her emotions. "Come with me," he said quietly. He led her through the house to a room she'd never been in before, a small sitting area off the main hallway that had been converted into a makeshift office space. It was where Darius spent his breaks, she realized, seeing a book on the side table and a coffee mug beside it. "Sit," he said, guiding her to the couch before disappearing into an adjoining bathroom. He returned with a glass of water, pressing it into her hands. Isabel took a sip, her hands shaking slightly. "I'm sorry you had to be part of that." "Don't apologize," Darius said, sitting beside her but maintaining a careful distance. "You have nothing to be sorry for." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. Finally, Isabel spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know?" "That I knew about his affairs?" Darius was quiet for a moment. "The way you react when he texts. Or doesn't text. The way you never ask where he is. And the look in your eyes," he paused, like someone who's stopped hoping for things to change. Isabel felt a tear escape despite her best efforts. "You see too much." "Maybe," Darius agreed. "Or maybe I just pay attention to things that matter." The intimacy of the moment was almost unbearable. Isabel set down the water glass and turned to face him fully, searching his eyes. "What are we doing, Darius?" she asked, her voice raw. "This thing between us. This pull. What is it?" His dark eyes held hers, and she saw her own struggle reflected there, the war between right and wrong, should and want. "It's dangerous," he said finally. "It's inappropriate. It could destroy both our lives. But, I can't seem to stop it," he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. "And God help me, I'm not sure I want to." The confession hung in the air between them, electric and terrifying. Isabel felt her heart racing, felt the heat of his presence beside her. "I need to know something," she said. "When you look at me, what do you see?" Darius took a shaky breath. "I see a woman who's stronger than she knows, who's been dimmed but not destroyed. I see kindness and grace and a spirit that refuses to be completely broken. I see someone who deserves to be loved, truly loved, not possessed like a beautiful object." His words broke something open inside her. Without thinking, without planning, Isabel closed the distance between them and pressed her lips to his. For a heartbeat, Darius froze. Then, with a low sound that was almost a growl, he pulled her against him, one hand sliding into her hair while the other wrapped around her waist. The kiss was everything the moment in the conservatory had promised, and more, hungry and desperate, and impossibly tender all at once. Isabel melted into him, her hands clutching his shoulders, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. This was what she'd been missing, this connection, this spark, this feeling of being wanted not for what she looked like or what she represented, but for who she was. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Darius rested his forehead against hers, his hands still tangled in her hair. "We can't," he whispered, but he didn't let her go. "I know," Isabel whispered back, even as she pressed closer to him. "This is wrong." "I know. It'll destroy everything." "I know," she said again, then pulled back to look into his eyes. "But I don't care anymore. I'm so tired of being alone in a marriage that's just a beautiful lie. I'm tired of pretending I don't feel this." "Isabel," Darius said, cupping her face in his hands. "If we do this, if we cross this line, there's no going back. Then maybe I don't want to go back," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Maybe I want to finally move forward." She saw the moment his resolve crumbled, saw the desire overtake the duty in his eyes. He pulled her to him again, kissing her with a passion that made her head spin. His hands roamed her back, feeling the silk of her robe, the curve of her waist, and Isabel felt herself responding in ways she hadn't in years, maybe ever. "Not here," Darius said against her lips. "If we're doing this, if we're really doing this, not in some side room where anyone could walk in." Isabel pulled back, breathless and dizzy with want. "My bedroom," she heard herself say. Richard won't be back tonight. Are you sure? Darius searched her eyes. Once we do this, everything changes. Everything is already changed, Isabel replied. I felt it the first time you really looked at me. I've just been too scared to admit it. She stood, her legs unsteady, and held out her hand. Darius looked at it for a long moment, and she could see him making the choice, weighing duty against desire, right against what felt real. Then he took her hand, his large palm engulfing hers, and stood. Together, they walked through the quiet house, up the curved staircase, toward a line they both knew they were about to cross. Isabel's bedroom felt different as she led Darius inside, the familiar space transformed by his presence. She'd spent so many lonely nights here, staring at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness of the king-sized bed beside her. Now, with Darius standing in the middle of the room, everything felt charged with possibility. He turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers one more time. Last chance to stop this, he said quietly. Last chance to turn back. In answer, Isabel reached for the tie of her robe, letting the silk fall open. Beneath it, she wore only an ivory slip, the fabric thin and clinging. She watched Darius's eyes darken, saw his jaw clench as he took in the sight of her. I don't want to turn back, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want you. All of you. Tonight, right now, I want to feel something real. Darius closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands finding her face, her hair, her waist, as if he couldn't decide where to touch first. When he kissed her, it was with a hunger that made her knees weak, his tongue sliding against hers in a rhythm that promised so much more. Isabel's hands found the hem of his shirt, pulling it up and over his head. She'd seen him shirtless before, in the gym, but touching him was different. Her palms explored the ridges of his abdomen, the broad planes of his chest, feeling his heart pounding beneath her fingers. You're beautiful, she whispered, tracing the definition of his muscles. Darius made a sound low in his throat, his hands sliding the robe completely off her shoulders, letting it pool at their feet. You have no idea, he said, his voice rough with desire, how long I've wanted to do this. How many nights I've lain awake thinking about touching you. His words sent heat pooling low in Isabel's belly. Show me, she urged. Show me what you've been thinking about. What followed was a lesson in patience and passion. Darius took his time, his hands and mouth exploring every inch of her like he was memorizing her, worshipping her. The slip came off slowly, revealing her body inch by inch, and Isabel felt seen in a way she never had before, not as an object to possess but as a woman to cherish. When Darius finally laid her back on the bed, his body covering hers, Isabel felt tears prick her eyes at the overwhelming rightness of it. This was what connection was supposed to feel like, what intimacy truly meant. Are you crying? Darius asked, concern flooding his face. Do you want to stop? No, Isabel said, pulling him down to her. I'm crying because this, it's more than I ever hoped to feel. Their joining was slow and intense, Darius moving inside her with a controlled passion that built and built until Isabel thought she might shatter from the pleasure of it. He whispered her name like a prayer, and she clung to him like an anchor, both of them lost in the connection that went far beyond physical. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, Darius's dark skin beautiful against the white sheets, Isabel's blonde hair spread across his chest. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder while she listened to the steady beat of his heart. What happens now? Isabel asked quietly, reality beginning to creep back in. Darius was silent for a moment, his hands stilling. I don't know, he admitted. This changes everything. Isabel propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at his face. Do you regret it? No, he said immediately, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Not for a second. But that doesn't make it less complicated. I know, Isabel said, pressing a kiss to his palm. But for tonight, can we just be here? Can we just be us, without thinking about tomorrow? Darius pulled her back down against his chest, his arms wrapping around her securely. For tonight, he agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, stealing a few hours of peace before the dawn would bring all the complications they were choosing to ignore. When Isabel woke, the early morning light was just beginning to filter through the curtains. Darius was still beside her, his face peaceful in sleep, and for a moment she let herself imagine this was her real life, waking up beside this man who saw her, who wanted her for who she was rather than what she represented. But reality couldn't be held off forever. Darius stirred, his eyes opening to meet hers, and she saw the same conflict playing out across his features, joy at their connection wearing with the knowledge of what they'd done. "Good morning," he said softly, his hand finding hers beneath the covers. "Good morning," Isabel replied, suddenly shy despite everything they'd shared in the night. They rose slowly, both reluctant to break the bubble they'd created. As Darius dressed, pulling his clothes back on, Isabel wrapped herself in her robe and watched, memorizing every moment. "I should go," he said, but he made no move toward the door. "Before the staff starts arriving," Isabel nodded, knowing he was right but hating it anyway. "The gala tonight," she said. "You'll be there?" "I'm your security," Darius replied. "I'll be there, but—" He paused, looking at her with such intensity it made her chest ache. "I'll be watching you standing beside your husband, and I don't know how I'm going to bear it." She crossed to him, rising on her toes to kiss him once more. "Then we make the most of the moments we have," she said. "Whatever they are, whenever we can steal them." Darius pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "This isn't over," he said. "I don't know what it is or where it's going, but it's not over." "No," Isabel agreed. "It's not over. It's just beginning." After he left, Isabel stood at her window watching the sun rise over the manicured grounds, feeling the weight of what she'd done settling over her. She'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, betrayed vows she'd made, even if those vows had felt hollow for years. But she couldn't bring herself to regret it. For the first time in 5 years, she felt alive, felt desired, felt seen, and whatever price she would have to pay for that, it had been worth it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Running late. Meet you at the venue tonight. Car will pick you up at 6. Isabel stared at the message, at the casual dismissal of her, the complete lack of intimacy or warmth. She thought about last night, about Darius's hands on her skin, his voice whispering her name, the way he'd held her like she was precious. She couldn't go back to the emptiness. She wouldn't. Whatever came next, whatever consequences followed, she was done living half a life in a gilded cage. The day of the gala passed in a blur of preparations. Hair and makeup teams descended on the house, transforming Isabel into the perfect billionaire's wife. The midnight blue gown fit like it had been painted on, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw what everyone else saw, a stunning blonde woman dripping in diamonds, the picture of wealth and elegance. But underneath, she was someone else entirely now. Underneath, she was a woman who'd tasted real passion and couldn't forget the flavor of it. Darius appeared as she was doing her final check in the mirror, and their eyes met in the reflection. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, looking devastatingly handsome, but it was the way he looked at her that made her breath catch, like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "The car's ready," he said, his professional tone at odds with the heat in his eyes. Isabel turned to face him, closing the distance between them. In her heels, she was almost at eye level with him. She reached up, straightening his already perfect tie, using the excuse to touch him. "How do I look?" she asked, though what she was really asking was much deeper. "Perfect," Darius replied, his hand coming up to cup her face for just a moment. Then, lower. "Too perfect. This is going to be the hardest night of my life." "Mine too," Isabel whispered. They stood like that for a moment too long, until the sound of the town car's horn broke the spell. Isabel stepped back, smoothing her dress, rebuilding the walls of Mrs. Ashford that she would need to wear tonight. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The gala was being held at the city's most prestigious hotel, the ballroom transformed into a glittering wonderland of crystal and light. Isabel arrived to find Richard already there. holding court with a group of investors. He barely glanced at her when she approached, just took her hand and pulled her into place beside him like she was an accessory he'd almost forgotten. "Darling, you look lovely," he said absently, his attention already back on the men around him. "Gentlemen, my wife, Isabel." She smiled her practiced smile, shook hands, made small talk, all while feeling Darius's presence somewhere in the room. He was doing his job, scanning for threats, maintaining a professional distance, but she could feel his eyes on her, could sense the connection between them like a taut wire. The evening wore on. Dinner was served, speeches were made, donations were pledged. Richard's hand rested possessively on Isabel's waist as they posed for photographers, and she wondered how she'd ever thought this was enough, this performance of marriage without any of the substance. When Richard excused himself to take a business call, leaving Isabel alone at their table, she felt rather than saw Darius approach. "Mrs. Ashford," he said formally, "for the benefit of anyone who might be listening, I need to discuss a security matter. Would you mind stepping into the hallway?" Isabel's pulse quickened. "Of course," she replied, rising gracefully. He led her through the crowded ballroom, past chattering guests and waiters with champagne, to a quiet hallway lined with artwork. As soon as they were alone, Darius pulled her into an alcove, his hands finding her waist. "I've been going crazy watching you," he said, his voice rough. "Watching him touch you, seeing you smile that fake smile." "It's torture," Isabel agreed, her hands sliding up his chest. "Being this close to you and having to pretend you're just the hired help." "We need to be careful," Darius warned, even as he pulled her closer. "If anyone sees, then we won't get caught," Isabel said, rising on her toes to kiss him. The kiss was heated and desperate, both of them pouring their frustration into it. Darius's hands roamed her back, careful not to disturb her perfectly styled hair or smudge her makeup, but she could feel his restraint crumbling. "I want you," she whispered against his lips. "Right now." Darius groaned, resting his forehead against hers. "You're killing me." "There's a private lounge on the 3rd floor," Isabel said, her heart pounding. "The one reserved for VIP guests. I have the key." She saw the war in his eyes, duty battling desire. Then his jaw set with determination. "5 minutes," he said. "You go first. I'll follow." Isabel smoothed her dress and checked her reflection in a nearby mirror before slipping back into the ballroom. She made her way through the crowd, stopping to chat briefly with various guests, all while her pulse raced with anticipation. Richard was still on his phone call, barely noticing as she excused herself to freshen up. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt endless. When the doors opened, Isabel hurried down the carpeted hallway to the VIP lounge, her hands shaking as she unlocked the door. The room was elegant and private, furnished with plush couches and soft lighting. She'd barely closed the door behind her when it opened again. Darius slipped inside, locking it behind him, and then his hands were on her, pulling her against him with a hunger that made her gasp. "This is insane," he breathed against her neck, his hands sliding down her sides. "Anyone could find us." "Then we better make it quick," Isabel replied, already reaching for his belt. What followed was frantic and desperate, both of them stealing pleasure with the knowledge that they had mere minutes before their absence would be noticed. Darius lifted her onto a side table, pushing her dress up around her thighs, and Isabel wrapped her legs around him, pulling him closer. Afterwards, as they frantically straightened their clothes and checked their appearances, Darius caught her hand. "This can't keep happening," he said, though his eyes told a different story. "We're playing with fire." "I know," Isabel replied, "but I can't seem to stop." "Neither can I," he admitted, "and that scares the hell out of me." They returned to the gala separately, slipping back into their roles. But something had shifted. The pretense felt more unbearable now, the gulf between her public life and her private desires growing wider with each passing moment. Richard appeared at her side, surprisingly sober and attentive. "There you are," he said, taking her arm. "I've been looking for you." "The ambassador wants to meet you." Isabel let herself be led away, playing her part. all while feeling Darius's eyes on her from across the room. This double life couldn't last. Something would have to give, but for now, she had stolen moments and secret touches, and they would have to be enough. The days following the gala became a careful dance of stolen moments and mounting tension. Richard returned to the city more frequently, his absences growing longer, his disinterest in Isabel more pronounced. She should have felt relief at his neglect, but instead, it amplified her guilt over what she was doing with Darius. Late one afternoon, Isabel found herself in the pool house again, ostensibly to swim, but really hoping to see Darius. He'd been distant since the gala, professional to a fault, and she missed the warmth of his presence. She slipped into the water, letting the cool liquid envelope her as she began her laps, trying to clear her mind. She didn't hear him enter, didn't know he was there until she surfaced at the shallow end and found him standing at the pool's edge, watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said quietly. "It's not safe." Isabel pulled herself out of the water, droplets streaming down her skin. "I'm not alone. You're here." Darius's jaw tightened as he watched water slide down her neck, her collarbone, following the curves of her body. "That's the problem," he said, his voice rough. "I can't keep my professional distance anymore. Every time I look at you, all I can think about is how you felt in my arms." "Then stop fighting it," Isabel said, moving toward him. He caught her wrist as she reached for him, his grip gentle but firm. "We need to talk, really talk, about what this is and where it can possibly go." They sat on the pool deck, Isabel wrapped in a towel, Darius maintaining a careful distance that felt like miles. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the water as they finally confronted the reality of their situation. "I can't be the other man," Darius said, his eyes steady on hers. "I won't hide in the shadows while you play the perfect wife. You deserve better than that, and so do I." "I know," Isabel said quietly. "You're right. This isn't fair to either of us. So what do we do?" The question hung heavy between them. Isabel thought about her marriage, about the prenuptial agreement she'd signed that would leave her with almost nothing if she divorced Richard. She thought about the life she'd built, empty as it was, and the terrifying prospect of starting over with nothing. But then she looked at Darius, at this man who saw her, truly saw her, who made her feel alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. And she knew what she had to do. "I want to leave him," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I want to file for divorce. I don't care about the money or this house or any of it. I just want to be free." Darius's expression softened. "Isabel, I can't ask you to give up everything. You're not asking," she interrupted. I'm choosing myself for once. And yes, I'm choosing you too, if you'll have me." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "You know I will," he murmured into her hair. "But we do this right. You talk to your husband, you start the legal process, and we wait until you're free. No more sneaking around." Isabel nodded against his chest, feeling both relieved and terrified. "Okay," she agreed. "I'll tell Richard tonight." But that night, everything changed. Richard came home unexpectedly, his face flushed with anger, his usual composure shattered. He stormed into the house, slamming doors, and Isabel knew immediately that something was wrong. She found him in his study, pouring himself a large whiskey with shaking hands. "Richard, what's happened?" He turned to her, his eyes blazing. "My company is being investigated. Some whistleblower leaked information about accounting irregularities. If this goes public, I could lose everything." Isabel felt cold dread wash over her. "What kind of irregularities?" Richard's laugh was bitter. "The kind that could send me to prison if they can prove intent." He drained his glass and poured another. "I need you, Isabel. I need you to stand by me through this, to present a united front." The irony wasn't lost on her. After years of neglect, of affairs and dismissal, now he needed her. She thought about the divorce papers she'd been planning to serve him, about the freedom she'd been ready to claim. I don't know if I can do that, she said quietly. Richard's eyes narrowed. What do you mean you don't know? You're my wife. You'll do what's required. Like you've been doing what's required? Isabel felt anger rise in her chest. Like being faithful? Like actually treating me as a partner instead of a possession? This isn't the time for your wounded feelings, Richard snapped. I'm facing prison, Isabel. Prison. Do you understand what that means? Before she could respond, there was a knock at the study door. Darius entered, his expression carefully neutral. Mr. Ashford, there are federal agents at the gate. They have a warrant. What followed was chaos. Agents swarmed the house, boxing up documents and computers. Richard was questioned for hours while Isabel sat in the living room, watching her carefully constructed world crumble. Darius stayed close, his presence a silent comfort, though they couldn't speak freely with so many people around. By dawn, the agents had left, taking boxes of evidence with them. Richard sat slumped in his study, looking older than Isabel had ever seen him. His lawyer had advised him that charges were likely, that he should prepare for the worst. Isabel stood in the doorway, feeling something shift inside her. Despite everything, despite his affairs and his neglect, she couldn't help but feel pity for the broken man before her. I'll stand by you through the legal proceedings, she heard herself say. But Richard, once this is over, I want a divorce. He looked up at her, something like surprise crossing his features. You're serious. I am, Isabel said firmly. I've been unhappy for years. We both have. It's time to stop pretending. Is there someone else? Richard asked, his voice hollow. Isabel hesitated, then decided on honesty. There could be. But that's not why I'm leaving. I'm leaving because I want to find myself again. The person I was before I became Mrs. Ashford. Richard nodded slowly, seeming to deflate further. I suppose I can't blame you. I haven't been much of a husband. No, Isabel agreed quietly. You haven't, but I haven't been honest either. We've both been living a lie. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers and media scrutiny. Richard's case became headline news, and Isabel found herself thrust into the spotlight she'd always avoided. Reporters camped outside the gates. Photographers with long lenses tried to catch her at vulnerable moments. Through it all, Darius was her rock. He kept the media at bay, provided security and comfort, and respected the boundaries they'd set. They didn't cross physical lines again, but the emotional connection between them only deepened. One evening, as they sat in the library going over security protocols for yet another court appearance, Isabel set down the papers and looked at Darius. Thank you, she said simply, for staying. For not running when things got complicated. Darius reached across the table, taking her hand. I told you, I'm not going anywhere. We said we'd do this right, and that's what we're doing. Even if Richard goes to prison? Even if I'm dragged through the mud alongside him? Even then, Darius said firmly. You're worth waiting for, Isabel. However long it takes. Tears welled in her eyes. No one's ever said that to me before. Then they were fools, he replied, squeezing her hand. Because you're extraordinary. The trial began in the fall, a media circus that consumed their lives. Isabel attended every day, sitting behind Richard as his lawyers fought to prove his innocence. The evidence was damning, years of financial manipulation and fraud laid bare for the world to see. Through the testimony, Isabel learned things about her husband she'd never known. The depths of his deception, the people he'd hurt in his pursuit of wealth. She felt sick listening to it, realizing how completely she'd failed to see who she'd married. When the verdict came down, guilty on multiple counts, Isabel felt oddly numb. Richard would serve 5 to 7 years in federal prison. His empire would be dismantled, his assets seized to pay restitution to those he'd defrauded. Including, his lawyers informed Isabel, the house, and most of her personal assets. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed meant she had no claim to his wealth, and that wealth was being confiscated anyway. She walked out of the courthouse into a sea of reporters, Darius clearing a path through them to the waiting car. As they drove away, Isabel looked back at the building where her husband would be sentenced, and felt something like freedom. "I have nothing," she said to Darius. "No money, no house, nowhere to go. You have yourself," Darius replied. "That's more than you had when you were living in that mansion." He was right, she realized. For the first time in 5 years, she was free. Broke and uncertain, but free. Darius took her to a modest apartment he'd been renting, insisting she stay there while he bunked with a friend. It was small and simple, nothing like the luxury she'd grown accustomed to, but it felt like a sanctuary. That night, as Isabel unpacked the few belongings she'd been allowed to keep, she found her old sketchbook buried at the bottom of a box. She hadn't drawn in years, hadn't even thought about it. Now, sitting in this small apartment, she opened to a blank page and began to sketch. Her hand moved across the paper, rusty at first, but growing more confident. She drew Darius's face from memory, capturing the strength in his features, the warmth in his eyes. She drew until the early morning hours, feeling something wake up inside her that had been dormant for too long. When Darius returned the next morning to check on her, he found her asleep on the couch, surrounded by sketches. He studied them quietly, a smile crossing his face as he recognized himself in her artwork. "You're talented," he said when she woke. "Really talented." Isabel blushed, feeling vulnerable in a way she hadn't since she was young. "I used to dream about being an artist. Before I got practical and married for security. Maybe it's time to dream again," Darius suggested gently. Over the following months, Isabel rebuilt her life piece by piece. She got a job at a local coffee shop, the first real work she'd done in years. The pay was modest, but she found satisfaction in the simple routine of it. She rented a tiny studio apartment, barely bigger than her old closet, and set up an easel in the corner. And she painted. Late into the night, she painted, pouring all her pain and hope and newfound freedom onto canvas. Her work was raw and emotional, unlike anything she'd done before. Darius supported her through it all, though they still maintained appropriate distance. He'd taken a new security position, but he made time for her, taking her to art galleries, encouraging her to submit her work to local shows. "It's time," he said one evening, as they sat in her tiny apartment sharing takeout. "The divorce is final. You've built a new life. There's nothing standing between us anymore." Isabel set down her food, her heart racing. "Are you sure you want this?" "One meh. I come with so much baggage now." Darius cupped her face in his hands, his dark eyes intense on hers. "I've wanted you from the moment I met you. Not Mrs. Ashford, the trophy wife, but Isabel, the woman, the artist, the survivor." He kissed her then, and it was different from their stolen moments before. There was no guilt, no fear of being caught. Just two people who had chosen each other, finally free to be together. That night, they made love in Isabel's small bed, taking their time, savoring every moment. Afterwards, wrapped in his arms, Isabel felt more at home than she ever had in her marble mansion. 6 months later, Isabel's first gallery show opened to surprising success. Her paintings, raw depictions of loneliness and rebirth, resonated with viewers. She sold several pieces, enough to cover rent for months and buy better supplies. Darius was there for the opening, proud and supportive, no longer her bodyguard but her partner in every sense. They'd moved in together, sharing that tiny apartment, building a life based on mutual respect and genuine love. As Isabel stood in the gallery, watching strangers connect with her art, she felt Darius's hand slip into hers. She looked up at him and smiled, thinking about how far they'd both come. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Everything you gave up to be with me?" Darius pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I didn't give up anything that mattered. I gained everything I was looking for." Isabel leaned into his embrace, surrounded by her artwork, living the life she'd once thought impossible. She'd lost the mansion and the money and the status, but she'd found herself again. She'd found real love, the kind that saw her and valued her for who she truly was. And that, she realized, was worth more than all of Richard's billions combined. The gallery lights glowed warm as the evening wound down, and Isabel looked around at the life she'd built from the ashes of her old one. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. It was hers. And standing beside Darius, his hand warm in hers, she knew she wouldn't change a thing. She'd walked through fire to get here, but she'd emerged transformed, no longer a trophy on someone's shelf, but a woman fully alive, fully herself, fully loved. 1 year after her gallery opening, Isabel woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of the small house they'd managed to rent on the outskirts of the city. It had a tiny yard where Darius had built her a proper studio, and she spent her mornings there, painting while he worked his security shifts. This particular morning felt different. Isabel had news that both terrified and thrilled her. She found Darius in the kitchen, making coffee in the old percolator they'd bought at a thrift store. He turned when he heard her footsteps, his face breaking into that warm smile that still made her heart skip. "Morning, beautiful," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Sleep well?" Isabel buried her face in his chest, breathing in his familiar scent. "I have something to tell you." She felt him tense slightly. "What is it?" Taking his hand, she placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Darius went completely still. His dark eyes searched hers, wonder and joy spreading across his features. "Are you serious?" Isabel nodded, tears already forming. "I know we didn't plan this. I know money is tight and the timing isn't perfect, but—" He kissed her, deep and tender, cutting off her worried words. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet too. "This is the best news I've ever gotten," he said. "We'll figure it out. We always do." That afternoon, they walked through the neighborhood, hand in hand, talking about the future. They discussed baby names and where they'd put a crib in their small house. They talked about Isabel's art commissions and how she could work around a newborn schedule. As they passed the park where Isabel sometimes sketched, Darius pulled her onto a bench, the same kind of bench where everything had started, though in a different place, a different lifetime ago. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd never met?" Isabel asked, leaning against his shoulder. Darius wrapped his arm around her. "All the time. I think about that lonely man I used to be, protecting people but never really connecting with anyone. You changed everything for me." "You changed everything for me too," Isabel said softly. "I was so lost, so disconnected from myself. You helped me find my way back." They sat in comfortable silence, watching children play and couples stroll by. Isabel thought about the woman she'd been, trapped in that marble mansion, drowning in luxury but starving for connection. That life felt like a distant dream now, something that had happened to someone else. "I don't miss it," she said suddenly. "The money, the house, any of it. I thought I would, but I don't." Darius kissed the top of her head. "That's because you finally have what you actually needed. Purpose, freedom, love, real love," Isabel agreed, turning to look up at him. "The kind that sees all of you and stays anyway." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they walked home together. Their little house with its creaking floors and leaky faucet waited for them, humble but filled with more warmth than any mansion could hold. That night, Isabel stood at her easel in the studio Darius had built, her hand resting on her belly as she began a new painting. This one would be different from her earlier work. Instead of loneliness and pain, she painted hope. She painted new beginnings. She painted a future bright with possibility. Darius appeared in the doorway, watching her work with that look of quiet pride she'd come to cherish. "You're glowing," he said softly. Isabel set down her brush and crossed to him, slipping into his embrace. "I'm happy," she said simply. "For the first time in my life, I'm truly, completely happy." As they stood together in the golden light of the studio, surrounded by canvases that told the story of her transformation, Isabel understood that she'd never really been a trophy wife at all. She'd been a woman waiting to be set free, waiting to find someone who would love not her beauty or her status, but her soul. And in Darius's arms, in this imperfect, beautiful life they'd built together, she'd found exactly that. She'd found home.